Hello to everybody. And last week, immediately after the talk, I received an email from Sam, who told me about an Irish band called the Waterboys, who have a song called The Sea, or This Is the Sea. And so I listened to it, and the chorus is really, I could have called my talk this. So it goes, then you were tethered, now you are free. That was the river, this is the sea. Just summed up the talk brilliantly, doesn't it? So thank you very much, Sam, and keep them coming. I like to receive emails, and I do write back to people because I've got a lot of time on my hands at the moment for some reason. So this week becomes the fifth strange and wonderful thing about the Dharma. Next week's strange and wonderful thing, well, the next strange and wonderful thing, number 6, is the taste of freedom. But I'm not going to do that one because Sangratch has done this brilliant lecture based just on that one thing, the taste of freedom from this sutta. So I thought, why give another talk? So this coming week, if you want to listen to that, go to Free Buddhist Audio. You can listen to it or read the transcript of it. It's a really, really good lecture. So, and that will take us to the following week. Anyway, this week, it goes like this. So, furthermore, although the rivers of the world flow into the great ocean and showers of rain fall from the sky, no lessening or filling up of the great ocean is evident. This is the fifth wonderful and marvelous quality of the great ocean. Just as, although the rivers of the world flow into the great ocean and showers of rain fall from the sky, no lessening or filling up of the great ocean is evident, so also. Although many bhikkhus attain final nibbana in the nibbana element with no residue left, no lessening or filling up of the nibbana element is evident. This is the fifth wonderful and marvelous quality in this Dhamma and discipline. So that's the talk this evening. So first of all, although rivers flow into the ocean, as we heard last night, and also last week, also rain falls into the ocean, it doesn't get any bigger or smaller. We know now, of course, that that isn't true. We have to remember that the Buddha never actually saw the ocean, we don't think. So it was hearsay. And anyway, anybody who just lived by the ocean probably wouldn't notice the ocean getting bigger or smaller. It would take a long time to notice that. But we know now that the ocean does move around. But never mind. But the main thing is this idea of, although many bhikkhus attain final nibbana. So bhikkhus is those people I was talking about last week, people who leave home and go for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha and become wandering mendicants. And also women do the same too, and they become bhikkhunis. He only mentions bhikkhus here, but I'm sure he means bhikkhunis as well. Although they attain final nibbana, so nibbana is the Pali word for nirvana, enlightenment, awakening. In the nibbana element with no residue left. So the nibbana element, let me just talk about that for a little while. So nibbana dhatu is the word, dhatu. And dhatu, element is a very good translation of dhatu actually. It works really well because dhatu means the 6 great elements. So there's the text in the Majjhima Nikaya, a sutta called the Dhatu Vibhanga Sutta, and it's the Buddha teaching someone how to do the 6 element practice. I won't tell you about that right now, but just to tell you what the 6 elements are: earth, water, fire, air, space, and consciousness. Now that's strange, isn't it? From a Western point of view, the first 4 seem like elements. In space, yeah, maybe it all happens within space. 2 is an element, and this tells us a lot about the way the ancient Buddhists saw or perceived or conceived of the world, that there was no great difference between the physical and the mental. So consciousness is yet another element. So bhikkhus attain final nibbana. Final nibbana is parinibbana, and that's when somebody, the Buddha or an arahant, they die and they enter into parinibbana, which is nirvana without elements. I'm not going to go into that now. But with no residue left, that means parinibbana. No lessening or filling up of the nibbana element is evident. So nibbana here is an element, the nibbana element, the nibbana dhatu, which is quite interesting. And in 1975, Sangharakshita gave a seminar on the Udana, and including this text. And he had a number of things to say about this. It's quite interesting. Nibbana element suggests it's kind of out there, but it could also be in here because an element is consciousness too. And Sangharakshita thought that the Buddha more talked about Nibbana as a sphere, as a thing out there, than he did talk about it as a thing in here. I mean, we, modern Westerners, we tend to think that Nibbana happens in here. It's a personal experience. But according to Sangharakshita anyway, the Buddha thought of Nibbana not only as a personal experience, but almost like a sphere that you enter into. But of course, talking about Nibbana as like an ocean that doesn't get bigger or smaller, the Buddha was talking about Nibbana metaphorically, you know, as a metaphor. Nibbana is like the ocean. And there's a problem with metaphors in that we forget they're metaphors and we take them literally. And then we come up with problems, because if you take a metaphor literally, it's always present you with a problem, doesn't it? So the problem here is, oh, if Nibbana is like an ocean, an ocean's a certain size, isn't it? So you can't have that many people getting enlightened then, can you? Because if they all got enlightened, the ocean would spill out everywhere. So you need to be careful. So that's the problem that the Buddha's dealing with in this little verse. So another thing that Sangharakshita says about the Buddha and his teaching in that seminar is that he thought that the Pali Canon was very commonsensical. It wasn't critical in the philosophical sense. So the Buddha said things very, very simply. So, you know, the ocean, Nirvana is like an ocean, and that's all you need to say. You don't need to worry about that too much. But I've got a few things to say about that myself, actually, because a few years ago, I read a couple of books by Walter J. Ong. I don't know if you've heard of him. He's another one of my favorite Christian writers. He's also called Father Ong because he was a Jesuit priest. But he taught about all societies in university. And, you know, there are a number of experts on all societies in this world. And they've done some really great work. And so one of the books I read was called Orality and Literacy by Walter J. Ong. And one of the things he says is that we, literate people, when we try to imagine, if you ever do try to imagine, but you can do it now if you want, try to imagine what it must be like to live in an oral society. He says we simply cannot imagine it. Because what we do is we imagine ourselves as we are in a society that doesn't have any writing, yeah, or printing or anything like that. And we try to imagine that. And then we, you know, maybe you might go on a retreat and you don't read anything. You think, oh, it must be a bit like that. But he says, no, no, it's quite different, because as soon as writing and reading came in, that changed our brain. It changed the structure of the way we thought of things. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about this now. Literate societies, we are able to think abstractly. So we think in abstract terms as well as concrete terms. But apparently in all societies, they were pretty much unable to do that. They didn't think abstractly, they thought purely concretely. And what that means is that one of the aspects of that is that people in all societies don't have categories. They don't categorize things. So they don't think categorically, they think situationally. So just the first point about they don't think abstractly. So this is guy, Alexander Romanovich Luria, Russian man, who went to Kazakhstan and another place in the Soviet Union. Let me just see if I can remember it now. And Kyrgyzstan, I've never heard of that place, in 1931 and 2. And what he did is he went round to these in villages and so on and meeting people, and he interviewed them. And those two countries, they chose those two countries because they were largely oral countries, largely oral societies. I say oral societies, I got this from Walter Ong, that you don't call them illiterate societies, because that's like a lack. They don't have literature, but they didn't think in those terms. They're oral societies, they've got orality. And so he went interviewing people to see what it was like to live in an oral society. And they were long interviews, long relaxed interviews in cafes and so on. And what he discovered was that one of the things he did was he had diagrams, like a square, diagram of a square, and he showed people the square. And some people are just beginning to learn to read and write. And when he showed those newly literate people the square, they said it was a square. And when he showed them a diagram of a circle, they said it was a circle, and so on. But when he showed the square diagram to people who were completely oral, they said, that's a tabletop, or it's a picture, or it's a door, or it's an apricot drying frame, all these kind of things. So it was concrete. They didn't think in abstract terms like that's a square. You don't get just squares in the world, you get square things, and they thought of the things. So I thought that was really interesting. But then another very interesting thing was that they think situationally rather than categorically. So another thing they did, where is it now? Yes. Subjects were presented with drawings of 4 objects. So one of the drawings was a hammer, a saw, a log, and a hatchet. And then they were asked which one is the odd one out. Okay, so I'll say it again. A hammer, a saw, a log, and a hatchet. Which one is the odd one out? Well, we all think, well, the log is the odd one out because the other 3 are tools and the log is just a log. But the oral people didn't think that way. Because they were all things in the world. They didn't categorize them. So a 25-year-old illiterate peasant said, they're all alike. The saw will saw the log and the hatchet will chop it into small pieces. If one of them has to go, I throw out the hatchet. It doesn't do as good a job as a saw. So that's the one that has to go if you've got to get rid of one of them. So I thought that was really interesting and well, fascinating, actually. And it's really interesting when you read the sutras, as I do, as you know, I read the Pali sutras. It's really interesting to read them with this in mind, because India in the time of the Buddha was a largely oral society. And could the Buddha read and write? Well, we don't know. I suspect he could, simply because of what these experts in oral societies say, in that completely oral people just do not think in categories, and the Buddha could think in categories. He could think abstractly. And one of the interesting things about the Buddha, as you probably know, is as soon as he's given an abstract teaching, he follows it up with a metaphor. And it's always something from what Walter Ong calls the living human life world. Yeah. So he might say the first jhana is like this. He gives it's got 5 factors to it and so on, or 4 factors. He does that, abstractly. And then he says, it's a bit like a man with soap powder and water and rubbing them together. And, it's a bit like that. And then the second jhana is there's 4 factors or 3 factors. And That's the abstract bit, and then he follows it up with it. It's like a subterranean spring. It's like having water, a pool, and there's water coming up from underneath. So immediately he follows up with things from people's living human life world. And it's very interesting to read all that, because enlightenment, what we call enlightenment or awakening, the Buddha called waking up, which is everybody does every day, they wake up. The way to enlightenment, what's the way to enlightenment? It's a path. So everyone knows what a path is. Everyone follows paths. In India at that time, there were paths everywhere, so they know what a path is. Insight is the opening of the Dharma eye. So insight isn't sort of like a category. It's more like an eye opens up, another eye opens up, and you see better. Or it's like pure white cloth and dye is put onto it. And so the pure white cloth is like the mind, and the dye is like the color of insight. And then, of course, this is something that Shakyajata mentioned after the first talk. She wanted to know about this. When somebody gains enlightenment as a result of the Buddha teaching, they say, "Excellent, Lord, excellent." It is as if someone were to set up what has been knocked down, or to point out the way to one who had got lost, or to bring an oil lamp into a dark place so that those with eyes could see what was there. So that's what they said when they gained some kind of insight. It was all metaphorical. And here's the Buddha talking about insight. He's talking to a king, so he says, "Sire, just as, sire, in the midst of the mountains, there were a pond, clear as a polished mirror, where a man with good eyesight, standing on the bank, could see oyster shells, gravel banks, and shoals of fish on the move or stationary." That's so detailed, isn't it? It's such a detailed picture of something that everyone in India probably would have seen. So it brings it right home to you. So the Dharma as ocean is just the way people used to speak in those days. There were no abstract ideas. There was just the concrete world that people lived in. You probably know some of the other epithets of enlightenment, the other shore. One of the interesting things about this is that most of the epithets of the enlightenment are on land, and water is seen as a very dangerous thing. So the other shore, this shore is unenlightenment, ignorance. The other shore is enlightenment, awakening. And you've got this river, very broad river to get across, and it's dangerous and you can get swept away on it. But the other shore is safe, it's a place of safety. There's one text where the Buddha talks about an island. The enlightenment is an island that you get onto. There's another lovely text where the Buddha talks about enlightenment being a delightful stretch of level ground. We kind of take for granted the level ground in modern societies because most ground is level. But it's very unusual in the natural world to have level ground. I remember when I've been to Dufyaloka a number of times, and there's hardly any level ground there. It's all up and down and everywhere. And if you go up, round and up to the mountain, if you go up the path, there's just on the left, there's a piece of level ground with a tree. And every time I used to walk past there, I used to think, that would be a great place to meditate. It's so level. And I began to understand what was so delightful about a stretch of level ground. And another time, the Buddha talks about the Dharma as an ancient city, a lost city, lost in the jungle. And the idea is it's always there, it's always been there. And what Buddhists do, they rediscover it. They find this ancient city. So there's all these wonderful metaphors in the Buddha's teachings. And of course, we have to be careful that we don't take them literally. But back to the ocean. Let's go back to the ocean, which is the topic of this talk. One of the interesting things about this is that it seems that the Buddha never saw the ocean, never experienced it with his own eyes. And probably the people he was teaching, most of them wouldn't have seen it either. So this is a bit different. This is not just this, you could say this isn't really from people's living human life world. It's an alien image. It's an imagined image. It's something they've never actually encountered, which makes it even more mysterious, I think. I'm going to read you something else now. We're going to stay with the ocean, at least with water, because there's this text called the Ratnaguna Samshaya, which is one of the early perfection of wisdom texts. And most of you will probably have heard, and some of you know of by heart, the very beginning of that. Call forth as much as you can of love, of respect, and of faith. So we all know that. Many of you do anyway. And that's Edward Contz's translation. But an order member called Sridharpa has translated it. And so I'm going to read you his translation. And it's the second two verses that are relevant to this talk. But I want to read you the first verse as well, just so you can hear a different translation of that very famous line. Arouse in yourselves the highest kind of love, reverence, and serene faith. Renounce the impurities of the hindrances and the defilements, and be at peace. Listen to the perfect wisdom of the gentle ones, set forth for the benefit of all and practiced by the heroic. The rivers that flow through this continent of Jambudvipa, bringing growth to fruit, flowers, herbs, and trees, depend on the power of the Lord of Serpents, the ruler of the Nagas who dwells in Lake Anavatapta. In the same way, the Dharma that the disciples of the victorious ones teach, the coherent explanations they set forth concerning the kind of action that leads to the most noble kind of well-being, and the results of this kind of action, all represent the achievements of the Tathagata. So, the rivers that flow through this continent of Jambudvipa. Jambudvipa is usually translated as Rose Apple Island, and it's a kind of mythical land. It's India, but it's also a mythical India. And Lake Anavatapta is right in the center of it, and it's a mythical lake. Anavatapta actually means not hot or cool, and it was understood to be a place of great healing. So if you doused yourself in it, all of the fires of your passions would be cooled. So again, it's rather like the ocean, it's rather like the state of enlightenment itself. But what's interesting here, I'll say a few more words about that actually. The rivers that flow through this continent of Jambudvipa, bringing growth to fruit, flowers, herbs, and trees. That's interesting because last week we had the rivers flowing into the ocean. All we were concerned about was them flowing to the ocean. But of course, as they flow through the land, they're doing good. You know, they're allowing crops to grow and everything. So as disciples of the Buddha move towards enlightenment, at the same time, they're also doing good. They're teaching the Dharma to other people as they go. So the rivers that flow through this continent depend on the power of the Lord of Serpents, who is himself called Anavatapta, that's his name, the king of the Nagas, who dwells in the bottom of the lake. So that's the idea. And in the same way, the Dharma that the disciples of the victorious ones teach, the Dharma is the rivers that actually flow out of the lake. So last week, the rivers were flowing into the ocean. This week, the rivers are flowing out of the lake. And they're basically disciples of the Buddha who are teaching. But their teaching comes from the lake. Specifically, it comes from the king of the Nagas at the bottom of the lake, who is, of course, the Buddha. So everything they teach immediately, eventually comes from the Buddha. So, what was I going to say about this? Have I said everything? Oh yes. So this is a perfection of wisdom text, and there's a legend behind the perfection of wisdom texts, in that the Buddha would have taught them when he was alive, but he thought that people weren't ready for them yet. So he gave all these teachings to the king of the Nagas, who took them away down to the bottom of this lake and only released them when people were ready, about 500 years after the Buddha. That's the legend. So that's the, although Lake Anavatapta is a mythical lake, it's very much kind of connected in people's minds with a real lake up in the Himalayas, up on the Tibetan plateau, called the Manosavara. Don't know how you pronounce that, Manosavara. Manas means mind. So it's a mind lake, which I think that's wonderful, isn't it? The mind lake, or the mind pond. So let's get back to the ocean. Now, the Buddha just said one thing about the ocean. He said, no matter how many people gain enlightenment, the ocean doesn't get any bigger or smaller. That's the only thing he said. Presumably, he was keen at the time to prevent a misunderstanding about the ocean and enlightenment and so on. That must have been on his mind. But there's a lot more to say about this image. I think it's a really great image for enlightenment. It's got so much to it. One of the things is that the ocean is other. In the Buddha's day, of course, because he never saw the ocean, it was very much other. It was an other thing. It was a mysterious thing that he'd never actually seen. So it's very much other in that sense. But the ocean is other to us too, because we do not live in the ocean. Other creatures live in the ocean. We have to live on land. So it's an alien place to us. We can't spend much time in there. We might have a dip in the sea for a while, but we can't spend a lot of time down there. So it's an other place. It's unknown to us. It's vast, you know, it's really vast, isn't it? Massive. But we only see the surface. We can only see the surface. Everything underneath the surface is foreign to us, alien. We don't know it. In a sense, we can't really know it. We know that it's deep. And the Buddha and his followers knew that it was deep. But what does that mean, that we know it's deep? We've got no idea how deep it is. No idea. So this is very interesting, I think, about the word deep. When we say something is deep, what we're saying is we don't know it, or we cannot know it. So when you say the ocean is deep, you don't really know what that means. You don't know how deep. And so I'm going to just read you this week. One of the things I did is I looked up the ocean from the scientific point of view, and I found this website called 10 Things You Never Knew About the Ocean's Deepest Places. So it says the ocean is deep. In fact, most of it is deep. Officially, anything deeper than 200 meters is considered the deep sea. But the average depth of the entire ocean is about 3.5 kilometers. And the deepest point is what they call the Challenger Deep in the Mariana Trench in the Western Pacific, is a little bit less than 11 kilometers deep, which is deep, isn't it? That is really deep. And they say that what that means is most of the living space on Earth is in the deep sea, or the deep ocean. And they've got these different categories. Depths from the surface of 0.2 kilometer is known as the littoral zone. From 0.2 to 3 kilometers is the bathyal zone. And from 3 to 6 kilometers, the abyssal zone. And anything deeper than that is the hadal zone. Hades, hadal from Hades. And that's comprised of deep trenches like the one I've just been talking about, down to depths of 11,000 meters. But even here, animals live blissfully unaware of how little attention they receive. And it's often said amongst scientists that you could get Mount Everest down there easily with a mile to spare. So it's really, really deep. But what does that mean to us? We just know it's deep. You know, 11 kilometers, 5 kilometers, it's just really deep, isn't it? It's unknowable, unfathomable in a way. So what I want to do now is I want to go back to something I mentioned in my first talk when I was talking about wonder, the sense of wonder. And something that the Buddha said a number of times. He said it soon after he was enlightened, but he said it a number of times through his career. He said that this Dharma I have discovered is deep, hard to see, hard to understand, peaceful, sublime, beyond the scope of reason, subtle, comprehensible only to the wise. So this Dharma I have discovered is deep, Gambhira in Pali, Gambhira, which means deep, profound, unfathomable. This is really good, unfathomable, isn't it? Because a fathom is a measurement in the ocean, isn't it? Unfathomable, unmeasurable, I suppose, hard to perceive, difficult. That's what Gambhira means. That's the first word of what the Buddha says. Profound. I looked it up, Middle English from the Old French profund, from the Latin profundus, deep. Pro is before, and fundus is bottom or base. And the word was used earliest in the sense of showing deep insight. So it's a great word to use, isn't it? Profound, showing deep insight. Hard to see. So this is really good when you think of the ocean. I mean, it's very easy to see the surface of the ocean, very easy. But it's very hard to see below the surface of the ocean. Hard to understand. I'm going to talk about this word understand a bit later, so just hold that one there, hard to understand. Peaceful. So the word is shanti, calm, tranquil, peaceful, pure. So the Dharma, as well as being deep, and profound and hard to understand, is peaceful. I believe that no matter how big a storm is going on the top of the ocean, deep down doesn't make a slight bit of difference. It just stays the same. It's peaceful, it's deep. What else have we got? Sublime. The word is exalted, sublime, beyond the scope of reason. Now that is a great word. Ataka vacharo, beyond the scope of reason. There's a couple of other words here. Unattainable by reasoning, being beyond the sphere of thought. And then subtle, that's nipuno, fine, subtle, abstruse. Comprehensible only by the wise. So this is what the Buddha said about the ocean. In a sense, it's so about the Dharma, and well, it is very much like the ocean, isn't it? It's deep, it's hard to see. It's you can only really see it by going down there, by going down into it. You can't see it from above. In another text, actually, the Buddha was talking to someone. He said that Tathagata, the Buddha, is deep, boundless, hard to fathom, like the ocean. So not only is enlightenment, but the Buddha himself is deep, boundless, vast, boundless, hard to fathom, like the ocean. Then, I think I've mentioned this before in these talks, but I want to mention again, briefly, Ananda, the famous time when Ananda went up to the Buddha, Ananda being a very close friend of the Buddha and his attendant, bowed down, sat down to one side and said to him, "It's incredible, sir, it's amazing. Actually, those two words, incredible and amazing, are translations of acharya and abutang. You probably don't remember. I mentioned these two words in my first talk, and it's the two words that we keep getting again and again in this series of talks: strange and wonderful. The 8 strange and wonderful things about the Dharma could be the 8 incredible and amazing things about the Dharma. Acharya abutang. That's what he says. It's amazing. It's strange in that this dependent origination, condition code reduction, pratitya samutpada, which is the kernel of the philosophy of the Buddha, is deep and appears deep, yet it seems to me as plain as can be. Don't say that, Ananda. Don't say that. The Buddha, that's what the Buddha said to him. Big mistake. This dependent origination is deep and appears deep. And it's because of not understanding and not penetrating this teaching that, and then he goes on about how much people suffer because they don't understand this teaching. So I want to talk about this a little bit. Many of you will be quite familiar with this little episode. We quote it quite a lot in our movement. So he says it's deep, and it appears to be deep, yet he's got it. It's really clear to him. And the Buddha says it's because of not understanding and not penetrating this that people suffer. Not understanding. The word translated as understanding, not understanding, is anuboddha. Anuboddha. So, anuboddha is understanding, kind of. Anuboddha is not, so it's not understanding. But anuboddha, does it really mean understanding? I looked it up, and it means awakening. So Bodha, Bodhi, Buddha, awakening. It means awakening. Perception. Perception is direct. Perception, it's seeing, it's hearing. Recognition, understanding. But the first word is awakening. So the Buddha could have said to him, maybe what he did say, what he meant was it's because of not awakening to this teaching that people suffer. Not to do with understanding the teaching, it's been to do with how the direct perception of it, awakening to it. And I wonder whether, when we hear this teaching, I have, and I guess many of you have as well, I've always thought the problem that Ananda had there, that the Buddha was pointing out, is he only understood it to a certain extent. He didn't understand it well enough. He didn't understand it deeply enough. But this makes me think that where Ananda made a mistake was not that he didn't understand it so well, but he was thinking in terms of understanding. And it's not something that you understand. It's something you awaken to. And his mistake was, it was a category mistake. And what the Buddha was saying to him wasn't so much that you need to understand it better. It was more like, it's not really a matter of understanding. It's a matter of having a direct perception. It's a matter of awakening to the truth of the Dharma. That's what it really is. And I'm thinking again of the sense of wonder. And perhaps insight and awakening, enlightenment, is not so much knowing things and understanding things as it is waking up to the wonder of the world. Here's something from the Perfection of Wisdom in 8,000 lines. It's a dialogue between Subhuti and the Buddha. Subhuti says, "Deep, O Lord, is the perfection of wisdom, the Lord, through a depth like that of space." Subhuti, "Hard to understand, O Lord, is the perfection of wisdom, the Lord, because nothing is fully known by the enlightened. Nothing is fully known by the enlightened." Subhuti, "Unthinkable, O Lord, is the perfection of wisdom, the Lord, because the perfection of wisdom is not something thought ought to know, or that thought has access to." In his lecture, The Path of Regular Steps and the Path of Irregular Steps, Sangharakshita at some point says, we don't really know anything about the Dharma. And then he says, I don't mean we know a little bit. I mean, actually, we don't know anything. That's the actual position. We don't know anything. And he goes on to talk about understanding, the word understanding. And he says the problem that we've got in this country with all these books and the internet and so on is you understand things and then you think you've got it. And he says that the problem with understanding, the word understanding, is when you understand something, you appropriate it. You own it. Yeah, I own understanding now. And now you're bigger than it. Yeah, it's in you. And you appropriate it, you understand it, you master it. That's what people master subjects. Always a master of mathematics and so on. So you master, which means superiority. When you understand something, you begin to think, or you think of yourself as being superior to the thing that you've mastered. That's the problem with it. And he goes on to quote Goethe in his Reflections and Maxims, saying, the finest achievement for men of thought is to have fathomed the fathomable and quietly revere the unfathomable. To fathom the fathomable and quietly revere the unfathomable. And he goes on to say this quiet revering of the unfathomable, that which cannot be understood, cannot be comprehended, which is atagavachara, which is the word that the Buddha used when he was talking about beyond the sphere of thought. In Buddhist terminology, beyond the reach of thought, beyond the reach of understanding and conception. The word understand is quite an interesting one because it's a metaphor. Most words, language is very metaphorical. And the word understand is quite interesting, to stand under something, which is interesting. You stand under something. Of course, when you stand under something, you look up. So that works quite well, actually, isn't it? Maybe we could change your understanding of understanding, the word understanding, rather than think of it as something that you bring into yourself, that you become the master of. When you understand something, you look up to it and you revere it. So we're going to end with another quote from The Perfection of Wisdom in 8,000 Lines. Now this is a quote that I've loved 45 years, probably. It's a fairly long one and I'm not going to read the whole of it. Just a little bit of it. And it's a lovely bit of theatre, actually. So we join it when Subhuti has been teaching Sariputra about the perfection of wisdom. And the gods have been listening. Thereupon the thought came to some of the gods in that assembly. What the fairies talk and murmur, that we understand, though mumbled. What Subhuti has just told us, that we do not understand. Subhuti read their thoughts and said, there is nothing to understand, nothing at all to understand, but nothing in particular has been indicated, nothing in particular has been explained. Thereupon the gods thought, may the holy Subhuti enlarge on this, may the holy Subhuti enlarge on this. What the holy Subhuti here explores, demonstrates and teaches, that is remoter than the remote, subtler than the subtle, deeper than the deep. Subhuti read their thoughts and said, no one can attain any of the fruits of the holy life or keep it, from stream winners to full enlightenment, unless he patiently accepts this elusiveness of the Dharma. to patiently accept the elusiveness of the Dharma. Goes on like this for some time, and it ends with, thereupon the thought came to Shakra, who's the king of the gods, let me now, in order to do worship to this discourse on the Dharma, which is being taught by the holy Subhuti, conjure up some flowers and scatter them over the holy Subhuti. Shakra then conjured up flowers and scattered them over the venerable Subhuti.